Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this panel. This is actually not a panel. This is a workshop on identity, European togetherness, values, and nationalism. The rapporteur for this session is Dalibor Rohac from the American Enterprise Institute. And I'll try to get you involved so you're on equal terms with us discussing the theme. With a few notes by Dalibor in the first place. I'll be taking notes and I'll be collecting your hands in the air, hopefully. We count on your vivid involvement, your opinion counts. We are expecting controversies, debates, as much as possible. So if you're truly nationalist, rather than European cosmopolitan, don't hesitate to speak up. Dalibor?
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be back in Prague. Indeed, this is your opportunity to, if not come out of the closet as nationalists, then at least to try to pretend to be one for the sake of the argument. And indeed, you are far more important than the two of us on the stage. This is about sort of us trying to aggregate your collective views into something that would be presented tomorrow in a sort of half meaningful, coherent form. I was asked before coming here to think through the questions for this workshop, to somehow frame the conversation, and I'll try to do that right now, with the caveat that I'm not going to tell you everything that matters, because you will find everything that matters in my new book, Towards an Imperfect Union, which just came out in May and is available in very reasonably priced paperback. Makes for a wonderful Christmas gift if you'd like to do your Christmas shopping early. But on a more serious note, there is a chapter in the book that deals precisely with this question of European political identity, which to me seems to be the reverse side of the same coin as the often mentioned issue of the EU's democratic deficit. One of the common criticisms of the European project raised by our friends on the Eurosceptic political right, particularly in the UK, figures such as Roger Scruton, for example, or John Fonte in Washington, is that for political democracy to function, it needs to be accompanied by some sense of political nationhood, by a sense of common political identity that helps people to accept as legitimate the decisions of the political authority which they might otherwise disagree with. Yet this question of political identity and its link to democracy, I think, presents us with a chicken and egg problem of sorts. What is it that comes first? Is it the set of political institutions that we have in Europe, or is it the sense of political identity, of some form of shared cultural togetherness? You look at the United States, and you'll see that in the case of the United States, it was a set of political institutions that seemed to have come first. You speak to historians that look at sort of the antebellum period of American history, and they would very often tell you that long into the 19th century, Americans thought of themselves primarily as inhabitants or citizens of American states, of Maryland, Virginia, New York, etc., and only then they thought of themselves as Americans. So in that sense, political identity, the shared sense of moral like-mindedness, if you will, is necessarily a work in progress. It's not some sort of God-ordained characteristic of feature of people. And so I suppose in the current climate, in the current European discussions, the million-dollar question is, well, there are several. One is whether we need anything like a shared European political identity, and then if we do, whether the existing European institutions are conducive to its creation. If not, what needs to change? What sort of institutional reforms would help for that sense of identity to emerge? And I suppose that's relevant, particularly in the light of the fact that the recent crises that the EU has been through has led in many ways to a resurgence, a reassertion of national politics over European politics. More and more decisions seem to be made and agreed on by member states, not by European authorities per se. The sort of nightmare that some of my Eurosceptic friends have of this super state operated from Brussels that makes all these decisions, I think, is very distant from the reality of muddling through and compromises and etc. that we are living through. So I suppose I'll stop here and I'll leave it in Wojciech's capable hands to conduct this conversation. But I mean, you are the main actors in this.
Yeah, but you'll have still to answer some of the questions.
Oh.
What do you think are the sources of today's nationalism? And that's a question to the floor as well, because it seems we have a surge of nationalist or sovereignist tendencies all across, maybe not even Europe, because it's not only European phenomena, but worldwide. Where does it come from? It seems everybody's traveling, everybody's buying things on Amazon or Alibaba Express or whatever elsewhere from other parts of the world. It seems anyone is really profiting from the global open world, but it seems the protest movement against globalization and for some sort of bordered nationalism is taking place. What are the reasons for that? And you know, it's a pity we seem to be rather homogenic in our approach and our position. But maybe I'm wrong. Speak up. Let's try to understand it. What are the sources of today's nationalism? Is it the same as 19th century?
Is the question addressed to me?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. It's a tough one. I suppose it's helpful to look at the resurgence of nationalist populist politics in Europe as part of some broader trend within the Western world, because you are seeing, you know, the Trump campaign in the United States, you are seeing populist tensions in places that have not been struck to the same extent by the problems that are plaguing the Eurozone or the Schengen area. And I suppose at some level, what we are seeing is a certain backlash against globalization, which has indeed generated many benefits and is making us much wealthier every day. But there are certain parts of our European Western populations that are not benefiting equally from these changes. It's arguably a temporary hiccup. It's a matter of structural adjustment. It's a matter of proper labor market reforms. It's a matter of reforming our educational institutions in a way that enable social mobility, etc., etc. But in the short term, there are fractions of the labor market, say in the United States, but also in Europe, that's seen very little real wage growth over the past decades, that might feel cut off from the political conversation. I think with the increased return to cognitive skills we've seen in the West, there has been a certain disconnect that has deepened between the cognitive elite on the one side and the rest of the country, whichever country you're talking about, whether it's the United States or any given European country, which I think has contributed to this malaise and ultimately to this populist backlash. And on top of that, in the European context, I think we should talk about the instances of what we could call the hubris of the European project. And if I can sort of play the devil's advocate for a moment, this idea that there has been arguably a disconnect between the ambitions of European integration and the goals, the policy goals that were set at various stages, and the actual tools available, particularly in the domain of in domains that required political decision making that would have been perceived as legitimate. There was this there's this growing sense in some countries that all these decisions were shoved down the throats of Europeans without really their explicit consent. So maybe at some margins, it is reasonable to say that perhaps the European project could become more humble, whereas we also know that, that on other margins there is a strong case for deeper integration.
Mm-hmm. Ladies, gentlemen, what are the sources of today's nationalism?
Thank you. I'm Petr Kratochvík, Director of the Institute of International Relations, here in Prague. I have just a very brief comment. It seems to me, in general, when answering that particular question, that it seems to me that every time we start to have doubts about our myths about the future, we revert to our myths about the past. That is the typical solution. It's something we know also from psychology, evolutionary psychology. When we are threatened, we regress to an infantile state. We curl up. And it seems to me that the nationalist reaction, the fierce nationalist reaction, is a part of this process. So in the same way you could say that the resurgence of religion in some parts of the world, of the fundamentalist type of religion in some parts of the world, is a similar reaction to the shattering myth about what to expect, what awaits us in the future. So that would be my first answer. And my second, I would very much agree with what has been said by Dalibor about the idea of the political demos that has to precede the political community. I find it utterly unconvincing because we know not only from the American case but also from the European, especially if you look at our so-called Eastern European nationalism, the national community and the political community were two very different things for a long time, and the political institutions came up in a very different context than the nationhood. So there, the disconnect could not be greater. I understand that for Western European friends it might be a bit different if you take the Western type of nationalism that evolved hand in hand with political institutions, with the state, nation state, then it's slightly different. But in our region, we should be the first to understand that nationalism is not a solution, or the idea of national political demos as a solution to this crisis seems utterly nonsensical to me. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other views? I mean, if identification of something like nationalism is connected to myths building and myths of the past that are evoked in the debate, is the answer to that some sort of rational debate referring to rationalism? Or it doesn't work, it won't work, because these two are not on the same weight in the public debate?
Okay. No, I don't think so. That would not be my answer. My only claim was that, I was watching a long TV debate on the Brexit. Nigel Farage and Nick Clegg and some others. And the arguments coming from the Brexiteers were all based on very convincing arguments for the publics, because at the end of the debate there was a vote, and the vast majority voted for the exit. So it clearly was convincing. But the ideas were, all about the greatness of the British Empire, about the racially pure British society. And even there you see how paradoxical, how nonsensical that is, because at the same time you claim that the British Empire was great because it spanned the whole globe, and at the same time that this was a society that was racially pure, even though he didn't use that term, right? So it seems to me that there are some myths that are dangerous, and some myths that are less dangerous, that promote some values we stand for. So it is not an argument between a mythical understanding and rationality, but between different sets of myths. And it seems to me that these old narratives of nationalism, racially or ethnically homogeneous societies, of religious purity, are all leading us to a very dangerous place. So that would be my argument, not replacing it by rational argumentation, but other kinds of narratives.
Mm-hmm. There is Irena.
Irena Krasnicka, Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I must really agree with what you said, and even yesterday we have discussed something like this, and I say the fact when we were discussing Euroscepticism, and I said the problem is that the Euroscepticism is made up from not rational, well, there are some rational elements, okay, but in fact it attacks the irrational in people. And so we cannot win over it if we want to win. It's a question, okay, but we cannot discuss with it, or we cannot do anything with it unless we will also attack heart, not mind. We have to attack heart, and we have to make people like Europe, let's say, or and we have to come with positive myths or different kind of myths. It's 100% sure because when people are feel endangered by something, let's be in my case, of course, that is like I deal with the migration crisis, so they feel endangered by something, rightly or not rightly, so they seek some safe place, safe haven, and it is very often the mythic past. And it wouldn't be good if it would be the myth which brought us to two world wars, where Europe after those was really marginalized and was poor and suffering. So we should, but we had probably some other myths in our past which are positive. So we should work with those positive myths. Okay, they wouldn't be 100% true because I mean history is a positive choice of facts and not the reality. But we should come with these myths. Let's say the myths of rebuilding Europe from ashes, and you know the founders of the EU on one side, on the other side, positive myths. Elements of myths which were like suffering under some non-European, you know, let's say, or living with wish to come back to Europe, to those countries which we are connected with by heart and history. So if we would combine these two myths, we would get a myth of the EU or Europe.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for those remarks. Let me bring your attention to two comments by Jan, both of them by Jan Stechlik. Maybe the first one is more now to the point, and we can discuss the second one later. Jan is bringing up the topic whether, saying or questioning whether we are living in post-nationalist era, and therefore it's because the nation state is fading away. There is sort of a nostalgia, there is sort of a fear of what's coming next, and again, some sort of entrenchment in the nationalist myths. But eventually, there is no comeback to nation state. Would you agree? Is there no comeback to nationalism in the form of nation states, at least in Europe? Is there not a possibility for the future can you imagine the future of Europe as nation-state Europe?
So I was on a panel last night with Jeff Gedmin, who quoted Mark Twain saying that history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think it's a nice way of looking at it. People at the beginning of the 20th century harbored this unrestricted optimism about the future. You read John Maynard Keynes' essay on on the era of globalization he was living in 1910, where he was writing about how any Englishman could order any good or service from around the world using his telephone and have it delivered to his home. He could travel freely, even without a passport, across Europe, etc., etc. And people were taking all these achievements for granted, and they were expecting the world only to get better. And I think it's very easy for us who've been, I spend most of my time, most of my life in a Europe that's been, broadly speaking, free and open and democratic. It's very easy to get used to this and to forget the fact that this is not the historical norm in Europe or anywhere else. So I don't think there is nothing. I don't think there is anything inevitable about the achievements that we have seen in Europe over the past 70 years. I think there are periods of progress, but there can be also periods of deterioration of political conditions, the economy, etc. So I very much wish for this to be the last sort of moments of anything like a nationalist movement in Europe, but I'm not quite sure about that. One reason why I'm not quite sure about that has to do with ideas and rhetoric. Ultimately, you have to, in a way, affirm the progress made and the institutions that embed it through persuasion, through sweet talk. And it looks like the globalization side of the argument might be losing in some of these discussions which we are having. I mean, you mentioned the Brexit debates in the UK, and indeed many people find the Leavers' arguments to be more persuasive. They resonate more. There is more energy coming from the Leave side, and it matters. I think we have to sort of reinvigorate the narrative of an open, integrated society, both at an intellectual level but also at a political level. We need leaders who actually are going to sell this to the voters in a credible way, and those kinds of people seem to be in relatively short supply.
But do you believe that there is coming back to Europe of nation states, no EU? Is it something that is seemingly an aspiration of some of the movements that are anti-EU, they're basing on the sovereignty claims? Is such Europe possible to your mind? Is it possible to imagine? Or, contrary to that vision, would you say that a completely other Europe is possible, that is some sort of federalist or centralist Europe? We are all afraid of these visions, and we'd better stick to what we have right now. Anyone? Please.
Okay, I have a very basic question. What is nationalism? Because, I mean, you are talking what is nationalism? I mean, I feel very happy that we are gaining in football against the French, who is sitting behind me. We might lose again against the Italians. We always lose against the Italians as a German team. Is that already nationalism? What is a red line? What is a red line? And if you look to the United States, or even more to Switzerland, you see how much they have their language identity, or even national identities, but still working together. So my question is perhaps a little bit academic at the starting point, but I think it's very important. What can we claim is still, let's say, something where I would say that part of a democracy that is organized according to national lines, or what is already, quotation mark, dangerous, risky for working together? I just wonder what is an indicator for that point. And I think that's an issue where strongly, if you take, for example, the debate about the euro, if you take some of my economic colleagues in Germany, are they anti-European? Most of them would say, no, we are the best Europeans because we think the euro is not the best economic way. So where is the risk? What is, let's say, where could we claim this is really, we could say perhaps racist at the other end would be, okay, we have perhaps the real bad boys we can identify, but let's say, what is the middle ground and where do we move in this sense? I have a second question. There was this famous idea of Habermas, the constitutional identity. That's a little bit, if you look to the Americans, the allegiance to the flag, to the Constitution. I think no American really read the Constitution, I guess. Is there something I love? The Lisbon Treaty, that you say, I put my hands on the Lisbon Treaty, and I think that creates me as European. Perhaps it's too early. I mean, if you look at the German example, I think we started to love our constitution only from the 60s onwards. Before, we didn't think that these were crucial, or we thought it's just a preliminary way to run our organization. So it's also an historical process. These two questions, I think, is very crucial also for political decisions. You know? What is acceptable, reasonable in terms of self-understanding, sovereignty, defending certain national traditions, and I would, let's say, recommend you to read Article 4 of the Treaty on European Union, because they clearly say the European Union respects national identities, and they have some, let's say, quotations in that. So where do we start to have a problem?
Yeah, but just briefly relating to that, could you, because I think when we speak about nationalism, the ism is important there as a part of the political ideology that is driven by something we all share, some attachment to national feeling, national belonging, where nationalism is already a political ideology based on and absolutizing this sort of belief to the point of political program. But that's ideal type. That's ideal type. Sure. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think there are lots of gray areas in this, but ultimately the distinction is between a sense of national identity, a sort of collective we, or perhaps even a healthy patriotism, an emotional attachment to a place or a collective group of people, on the one hand, and on the other hand, there is the sort of political doctrine or ideology that asserts, the uniqueness or superiority of one nation over others. That's sort of the 19th century version of nationalism that we've seen in various places. That also comes with a very specific set of policy prescriptions, such as the knee-jerk rejection of any form of pooling of national sovereignty, for example. And obviously, these sort of textbook definitions do not map cleanly into the world which we are living in, and there are other, shades and variations of it coming from, in some cases, as you mentioned, racism and nativism, etc. But I think as a sort of political compass, these definitions are still helpful. Nobody is trying to re-engineer Germans and Czechs and Slovaks into generic Europeans, right? Fighting against a national we in that sense is not helpful. What is helpful is try to instill an understanding that there are Europe-wide public goods that have to be provided through some European political process, and in that process, everybody, whether you are Czech or German or Slovak, in that process you are a stakeholder, and then you should try to be a responsible European citizen. I think that's the message I would essentially have for my fellow Europeans. And I think it speaks also to the Habermas question. I find his work really interesting, and it, I think, in some ways connects to the idea that's attributed to James Buchanan, an American political economist, who said that democracy was government by discussion, that you operated within a framework of common constitutional rules, and then you operated from the assumption that nobody really had the red phone to God, and you try to sort of iteratively, through muddling through, arrive at compromises that would be seen as legitimate. And for that you need some sort of collective identity, some sort of allegiance to that collective body, and that exists at the level of local government, national government, and if the EU is to succeed, it has to emerge somehow at the level of the European Union as well.
Mm-hmm. If I may add something to what you just said and what was raised by the gentleman there, I think what we're now discussing, using the terms proposed by the organizers as nationalism, is not, of course, nationalism as we know from the 19th century. This is not happening in Europe right now, apart from so far, so good, very small movements with little support. But there is a general global tendency of inward-lookedness and raising walls and borders everywhere around, which is a global phenomenon relating somehow maybe to the message of the past about nationalism and better at home than anywhere abroad. And I think we're on one hand discussing the roots of it, or trying to understand what it is, and maybe you can bring in your own examples from your own country, if you wish, if you may. But on the other side of this debate, workshop that we're having, we have to also address the question of what is there still of the Europeanness project, or European togetherness project. Let's maybe have a brief account of what sorts of challenges there are that arise from, quotation marks, nationalism today. Brexit, would we call it part of this phenomena, trend of, is it nationalism driven?
I see Brexit is very much part of this picture. I was with the book in London a few weeks ago, and I participated in a number of discussions and events and debates, including with Philip Davis, who is one of the most Eurosceptic MPs. He was the first MP to publicly call for departure of the UK from the European Union back in 2005, I believe. And one thing that struck me about the debate in the UK is that it's been overwhelmingly preoccupied by the UK alone. This is good for us, this is not good for us, this is in our interest, this is not in our interest. It was just us. There was no sense of recognition that actually on some margins the UK and Europe are connected, that although the UK can leave the European Union, it can't really check out of Europe. And I think one of the arguments I was trying to make is that it is ultimately in the British interest to be in the neighborhood of a prosperous, well-governed, peaceful, democratic European continent. That although the leavers might want to leave the EU, they can't really drag it halfway through the Atlantic. And I suppose that's one of the arguments that's not made often enough. On the other side, obviously, the UK has been, I think, a massive force for the good within the EU, and therefore, in the UK's absence, it would become a much less hospitable, less friendly, less efficient place, and that would come back to haunt the Brits as well. But I see Brexit very much as part of the same problem, and in fact, you see that there's this large academic literature on far-right movements and populism, and I think the general conclusion is that very often people project their domestic grievances, which are different in different places, and they project it against these unintelligible, large, distant projects such as the EU, and therefore you have different factors feeding into Eurosceptic movements in different places. In the UK, much of the discussion has been focused on immigration, and obviously the UK is part of the free movement of labor that exists within the single market, but has complete control over immigration from third countries. Again, something that I think receives very little attention in the debate.
We have, again, a few new questions from the floor. I would really appreciate if you wanted to tell us a little bit more about what you write. So that's a Christian, yeah. Would you please argue for your question? You're writing, do Eurosceptic want to return to nations or return to a strong state? And what would be your answer?
No, this is an answer to you, of course. But I'm struck that since the beginning of the discussion, we do not differentiate so much nations from states. And we talk about nationalism. I'm not sure that the main objective of the Eurosceptics is going back to nation. It's more going back to a strong state and a strong protective state. So are we sometimes making a mistake or a confusion when we are talking about return to nationalism when we speak of Euroscepticism? Because what the Eurosceptics want is more a political entity which protect them, and this is the state, and there is a strong legacy of the state in Europe. So my question is, how do you differentiate this process of returning to nations from the process of returning to states? And this is maybe an answer to your point that the Eurosceptics do not necessarily want the nationalism of the 19th century.
But as I explain in my book, Towards an Imperfect Union, there are different kinds of Eurosceptics, and indeed, I have a confession to make. I was one of them for a very long time. I started my intellectual journey, as a teenager, as a very staunch Eurosceptic. I wrote my first diatribe against the EU at the age of 17, and I also interned right here at the office of the President of the Czech Republic when Václav Klaus was in office. So I suppose I've sort of seen the argument from both sides. And I will tell you that there are different kinds of Eurosceptics, and some of them see the EU as an imposition that essentially stands between, say, the UK and some sort of idealized free market. So they look at these European regulations and the bureaucracy in Brussels, and they see it as a hurdle on free markets, economic activity, entrepreneurship in their country. I think that view is misguided for various reasons, but I think there are people such as Dan Hannan, for example, who sincerely believe that the UK would become a freer, more open society in the absence of a supranational layer of governance. There are other Eurosceptics who have very different goals in mind for a post-EU Europe. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why the Leave campaign is so eclectic and divided, and there is so much bitterness between its different elements. It's just a very, very odd coalition of people who would otherwise not be natural bedfellows. But I think it's something we are seeing as part of these political realignments across the Western world. The opposition to trade liberalization is bringing together people such as Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, and so on and so on and so forth. But ultimately, nationalism as a sort of ideology goes typically hand in hand with a strong role for the central state. And the way the European project was designed from the outset was to somehow provide a restraining mechanism that would prevent these states to become too powerful and too ambitious and infringe on either economic openness or the integrity of other countries.
There's a lady in the back, please. Yes.
My name is Barbara Lippert from the German Institute for International Security Affairs, and I would like to support Christian Lequin's view on the difference between, let's say, do people have a preference for the state taking action again, so this is normally the national level, or do we trust in any other institution at a supranational level? And I think what we experienced over the last 20, 25 years, many citizens, is just that we have a dismantling of borders, we have deregulation, all that's connected with the globalization issue. And now there's a big uncertainty because this kind of interdependence has now entered daily lives. And you see that, I think, with the migration crisis and the influx of refugees from Africa. And you are confronted with very, very wicked problems. And one of the reactions, I think, also in Central Europe is to go back to national solutions, to say, well, we should take control again over these problems, and they have a reflex, they have a preference for what they call sovereign decision making by their national state, by their nation state. And that, I think, is a problem, because we know that when we analyze the challenges, that these national responses will not be sufficient to solve the problems. But it is very, very difficult to generate legitimacy for anything else, for example, for supranational construction like the European Union. And I think what we also have to take into account is just that the nation state, not nationalism, but the nation state is directly linked to, I would say, functioning democracies. And that is something which is still of a problem for any other supranational construction. And here I think we should discuss how we can transfer this kind of legitimacy also to a more complex political system, which is, of course, and framework to take decisions, which is the European Union. There's a missing link. So I think many citizens just want to keep control, and their first reaction is to return to the nation state. I would not equal that directly to nationalism. It is fueled also by nationalism, which is that you have an absolute understanding, kind of superiority of your nation or whatever compared to the others, but this need not necessarily go together.
Mm-hmm. So would you say, rephrasing what you're saying and some making it a very short comment on my behalf, that you need, addressing also Vladimir Bizik's question, what we need is a new narrative for Europe which includes this national inward-looking feelings, or revamped, re-established in the Europeanness?
I'm absolutely skeptical as far as the artificial construction of narratives top-down are concerned. I think if you have strong democratic nation states, you can build a strong European Union. But what we now see is, on the contrary, that you have quite weak democracies in some of our member states. And I think that if you want to have this kind of revitalization, you should start within the member states and not at the top and have some sort of institutional engineering and changing the legal framework, the primary law again. I think that won't have the effect that you expect.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Again, the mic.
Thank you. I really like the two comments there, but but I have some disagreements still, so I wanted to address them. Because I myself deal a lot with Russia. It might seem disconnected from our debate here, but I'll explain. And in Russian, you have two different expressions for Russians. You have Россияне and Русские. The first expression means the citizens of Russia, basically, and the other means ethnically defined Russians. So you can very easily see in a speech when President Putin, for instance, speaks about the strong citizens of Russia and the strong Russians as ethnically defined community. And the interesting thing is that these are often combined within one single speech. He combines both elements there. And that seems to me is the strategy of many populist leaders around the world, both within the EU and outside. So the combination, even though conceptually it makes sense to speak, do we speak about the strong state or about the strong nation? But in practical terms, it seems to me, if you look at Trump, for instance, he starts from the need to recapture the state from the corrupt elites, or sometimes Bernie Sanders also uses the same rhetoric. But then Trump very easily jumps to, a quasi-racist comment about Mexicans, for instance. Or Farage, in the debate I was referring to before, starts from speaking about how we want to have a strong Britain again. But then he talks about those who are for Britain remaining in the EU as Bromanians, basically making a joke about haha, Bromanians, Romanians. So it is quasi-xenophobic again. So my argument would be these two things are different, but in practice, what we see now is often a combination of the two. And my second comment there is that strong state often is total opposite of strong democracy. That has to be stressed time and again. If you look at the one feature of the voters of Donald Trump, according to sociological studies, that differentiates them from the others, it's not education, it's not wealth, it's the attitude toward authoritarian tendencies. The voters of Trump are much more in favor of some authoritarian tendencies and much weaker democracy than the others. So strong state, in that understanding, in fact, does often translate into weaker democracy. So strong state, and I wonder, when talking about people like Marine Le Pen, does strong state for her mean strong democracy, or does it rather mean weakening democracy or strengthening authoritarian features of the French state?
Mm-hmm. Point made. Dalibor, any comments?
I very much agree with the notion that national identity or sense of sort of political belonging is not something that could be engineered and masterminded and then just sort of helicoptered on the European population. I'm very much in favor of such a sort of humble understanding of it as of a emerging feature of human societies. I suppose one thing how we can facilitate its emergence at the European level in a way that would then allow for some form of democratic decision-making to exist is to make sure that the European project actually delivers on a practical front, whether it's economic growth or coming across as being in control in times of crises. I don't think it's a coincidence, by the way, that we are talking about the resurgence of far-right, nationalist, populist, etc. movements, particularly at a time when the Western world is not only going through the structural changes related to globalization that I mentioned, but also at a time when the Western world is suffering still from the fallout from the financial crisis and from the sluggish growth in the Eurozone, particularly on the Mediterranean periphery. There's substantial literature now on the links between financial crises and and far-right movement. So there's this classic paper by the Broomhead and co-authors from 2012 that looks at the example of the Great Depression. This year, a German economist, Manuel Funke, and his co-authors actually aggregated data going back to 1870 until 2014, data on financial crisis, and they combined them with information we have on electoral results and also on the incidence of street protests. And what they found is that in the aftermath of economic shocks, such as the one we saw in 2008, 2009 across the West and later in the Eurozone, you see, first of all, increased share of vote going to these extreme parties, and also an increased fragmentation of the political spectrum, making democracy more difficult, even at the national level. And I think it's very much something we are seeing even today. And political compromises have become more difficult, whether you are in Washington or Brussels or Prague. I think there is sort of growing sense of alienation that people have from politics, and even more than alienation, even a sense of disdain and disgust with the whole thing, and that can lead, I think, to fairly dangerous dynamics.
Let's turn the table now, and let's speak about European values, European togetherness. It seems to me that there is a very good point by Jan Stechlik, again, who wrote that in 2013 we saw the people of Ukraine take to the streets, waving flags of the EU. Is there a sign that the European identity is possible? And I would add to that, is that a sign that your national identity, Ukrainian national identity, can be built with the use, with the reference to being European? And therefore, maybe there is no contradiction in the title of the workshop between these national feelings and European values. Is there a way to build or to acknowledge these national sentiments through Europeanness? It doesn't seem that we have had successful messages or narratives on behalf of the EU recently that would underline these national sentiments.
So I said,
or am I wrong?
I said I used to be a Eurosceptic, and one of the events that really led to my epiphany of sorts was the Maidan. So I was born and brought up in Slovakia, one of the more successful post-communist countries, and in 2013 I saw my Ukrainian friends go to the square in Kiev, and I was sort of asking myself why were they doing that? Did they not understand, like I did at the time, that the EU was this awful bureaucratic machinery and trying to regulate European economy to death? And ultimately I concluded that actually they were right and I was wrong, in the sense that Ukraine followed a very different transitional path from other post-communist countries. I mean, in 1990, Poland and Ukraine had the same per capita income. Today, Ukraine's per capita income is 1/3 of that of Poland, and obviously the most conspicuous distinguishing mark is that Poland joined NATO and the European Union, and every reformer in any of these more successful post-communist places, including Ivan Miklos in Slovakia, will tell you that the prospect of accession provided this really important commitment mechanism for reformers to do the right thing and to stick with the policies that were needed to move away from a centrally planned economy towards political democracy and open markets. And I think that's something that it's a message that's very difficult to sell to our British friends, for example, or to Western Europeans more generally, who are used to living under democratic capitalism, but I think it's a message that still resonates and should resonate in Central and Eastern Europe, because we should never take these past 27 years for granted. I mean, we are incredibly lucky to be in Prague at at the time like this. This is not the historical norm in this country or in this region. So I think the sort of argument for the EU as a sort of benign force that provides a commitment mechanism for politicians to do the right thing is an important one, and the Maidan, I think, is a very, very clear illustration.
Thank you. And but I'll have another comment from the floor. This is the workshop that should involve as many comments as possible. Yes?
Michal with Europeum. I'd like to make one comment regarding the question you've raised. When we are speaking about the national identity in the light of the European integration and the rise of the populists and national populists across Europe, I was trying to answer for myself the question why. And I recently came across a publication of Maurizio Ferrari, the Italian philosopher. It's entitled The Manifesto of New Realism. And he describes there the impact of the post-material and post-whatever, the era that these movements and these people have the same right to create the different reality of our current environment in terms of the language they use, the policy they use, and also the meaning and expressions of the identity, and of course the national identity or European identity. So I think we have to go, we have to step back and consider this as a battlefield, and consider that these people are creating a different reality of what the identity basically is, and not just to create or share new narratives, but consider this as an intellectual challenge, and to look at their arguments and to see, well, this is the given situation, and we have to cope with this as a political task, not as a creating something given.
Thank you. Further comment on this?
I mean, if I don't want to interject at every occasion, but I think that's broadly speaking correct. That on the one hand, political identity is not something that can be constructed and just handed over to the population. And now you are all Europeans, and you sort of feel like Europeans, and this is the way things will be. But it's really a result of an interplay of conflicts and debates and battles and different narratives, and sometimes one narrative prevails over another. European national identities themselves are a work in progress. They have not been here since times immemorial. You look at 19th century France, and you'll see way into the late 19th century a very much a fragmented country with different regional dialects, different political identities. The same holds true of for most European nations. I think at this time, if we really care about the EU providing certain fundamental Europe-wide public goods, we should be making the argument for why we need the institutions that we have, how we can improve them, and why they are a sort of common property of us all. And by making sure that these institutions deliver on these various fronts, I suppose we can ultimately win that battle, but it's not going to be automatic. I think it requires effort, both intellectually and politically. It requires leadership that we are not seeing enough of right now.
Any further comments from the floor? No. Well, one question from me then, maybe something that my curiosity here, you could help me up with this, or maybe someone of you could, is that there were intellectual proposals how to combat, let's say, 19th century nationalism. That was also formed as an intellectual project in books, in writing, in lectures at the universities. One of these projects to combat nationalism, I remember, well, forgive me for quoting this philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, was asking the question how to be a good European versus how to be a good German, British, Polish, Czech, or whoever else. Do you think there's any intellectual endeavor these days that combats or challenges this inward-looking, if not nationalism per se, then at least this trend? Is there some book, essay, proposal we should look upon, and we should, apart from your book, next to your book, that we should look into and I don't know, have a read and discussion about? What are the intellectual centers that are in Europe or beyond Europe that may offer some proposals?
Look, I think there are plenty of excellent academics doing important work on the politics of the EU, on the economics of the single market, on any given issue you can think of. That there is a vibrant community of researchers on great number of topics that are directly relevant to these discussions. I think what we are sort of lacking are dedicated second-hand dealers in ideas that would bridge the gap between the cognitive elite that's very often immersed in these conversations and a growing part of European
dedicated second-hand dealers of ideas.
Second-hand dealers in ideas. Yes, okay. I think that's the term coined by Friedrich von Hayek for intellectuals. I suppose people like us who don't really produce new ideas, but they sort of pick up on interesting ideas they've seen in universities and elsewhere, and then repackage them and sell them to a broader audience. I think we need to, seriously be doing that, because that's part of actually winning in the war of ideas. And that's one thing, but also it has to go beyond that. Very often, conversations about, say, democratic backsliding in Central and Eastern Europe, in Washington, always conclude on this note that we should do more to strengthen civil society and NGOs, etc. But I think that's not quite correct. I think what we need is to help nurture, if we can. I'm not sure if we can, but what is needed is a new generation of political leaders who are sort of willing to actually do politics and who are willing to sort of clash against the populists quite directly and bring some other positive narrative of why we need European institutions and, more broadly speaking, the infrastructure that underpins the globalized economy.
So just to be clear, as to examples, would Mr. Varoufakis, who was recently trying to build a pan-European democracy political movement, would be kind of your star?
Well, Mr. Varoufakis certainly has a lot of charisma. He's very impressive. But I think, in my ideal world, the sort of benchmark of leadership that I would look up to is one that's sort of based in reality, and I'm afraid Mr. Varoufakis' economics does not really hold water, at least doesn't most of the time. So I don't really see him as the savior, if that's your question.
There are two questions at least that I see.
Thank you. Radko Hogovský, European Value Think Tank. I'm thinking what's happening in the other two rooms. They are speaking about security and prosperity, and they are trying to answer the questions why the European project, European integration, is the answer to maintaining security and gaining prosperity, and how to do it. I think that we should think about this here as well, because tomorrow morning we will speak at the plenary panel, and there should be some answers what to do with the crisis of identity in Europe in order to maintain European togetherness. We have roughly 20 minutes left, and I think that we had pretty good analysis and historical comparisons, what happened in the 19th century. But I would like to propose the direction of our discussion towards, I mean, obviously there is this problem of emerging or already emerged leaders, populists, radical Eurosceptics, who are emphasizing either national identity or the solution as a state, and simply opposing European cooperation. The answer is certainly not, I mean, we can have all the technical, rational answers, institutional answers. Why is it important to deal with prosperity and security together, and so on? But there certainly is also some emotional reasoning needed, some narrative. It was mentioned here that top to bottom provision of narrative is not really working. But I'm asking how such a narrative, which could be shared among most of the European countries and most of the European citizens, can be produced. Who is the actor in the civil society, in our societies? Who is supposed to, who can actually produce some narrative which can be shared? Because if we don't find a certain unifying narrative, I'm pretty sure all these anti-European populists will win. So my question is, are these the political leaders? I mean, basically, I think they are the political leaders who should propose sort of narrative, common story with which the citizens in various countries can identify. Is it possible? Is it possible that a narrative coined or produced, formulated in one country, one language, can be actually shared in others? Of course, we had these narratives, we mentioned that in different panels yesterday. First it was peace, gaining prosperity. I mean, both security and prosperity is no longer shared by European citizens as the reason for having the EU, because many of the citizens do not anymore believe that actually the EU is producing prosperity and security, even though it can be contrary to the empirical evidence. So my question is how this more emotional reasoning can be produced. Who is the one who should formulate it? Who should fight for it in the battle of ideas? It's not only politicians, we have also other actors. This is my question. I would like to propose to brainstorm a little bit. Who are these?
May I have a mic there?
Martin Michelot, Head of Research at Europeum. I want to link the last point that was made and the point that Radko just made. Actually, it's very interesting that we're talking about the new politicians, because part of what is ailing us is this idea of the lack of renewal of the political class. And by all standards, if you had in France next year a new election between Nicolas Sarkozy and François Hollande, I mean, this would be the symbol of the lack of the most talkative, most loud symbol of this lack of renewal of the political class. But this is perhaps a little bit empty rhetoric. And one person that we can pay attention to the extent that he is kind of changing the way we view politics, is the Minister of Finance of France, Emmanuel Macron, who is trying to redefine the way political cleavages are framed in the political narrative in France. Not frame in issues along the left versus right framework, which does not speak to people anymore, but rather centering the debate around certain values. So perhaps it's a debate between globalization or interconnectedness and territorialism. So basically the idea of how you can reframe the political narrative around different issues is perhaps one of the answers that can help us create this new narrative or create this new language that keeps us all together. And this is really a damning indictment of the existing political parties, in which most people do not feel represented anymore. And I'd be very curious to hear in which country do traditional established political parties still hold sway, perhaps except for Germany. So really, I think this idea of how to redefine political cleavages, which has come maybe 5 years after the populist movements have started rising in Europe, is the one that we should be considering in our own countries, and how these new cleavages integrate themselves into a European discourse. Thank you.
Yes.
I just want to add one more thing. I think this is precisely the false dichotomy, which is extremely dangerous. I mean, if we will follow this argumentation, it's either European togetherness or national interest, we will fail. I mean, it's like a brain and the heart. I mean, rationally, it's necessary to stick together.
Who put this question?
Our staff, I don't know.
Who did this?
Who did this?
Please raise your hand.
But emotionally, it has to be, I mean, it's necessary to speak about nations, states, regions, whatever people do naturally already affiliated to. And it has to be combined with European integration and whatever. I mean, this is the narrative to actually combine these two. Without that, we are in a big problem.
I agree. I think the argument is that you pursue, individual welfare and well-being and national interest through European togetherness, and through, even more broadly, through an institutional infrastructure that allows for a globalized, interconnected, and free world. I think that's the argument we should be making, and that's why we need a new generation of political leaders to make it.
Okay, I mean, I have maybe the last and rather practical question to you. I mean, many of you have British friends. Maybe some of you have friends who will vote against Brexit. What would be your arguments for them to maybe change their mind, or at least be more considerate when standing over a ballot and casting a vote? Have you ever thought about it? Have you ever tried to convince anyone who is now taking a position to leave Britain, to leave from EU, to have Britain leave from EU? Yeah? Is it possible?
Well, I suppose I should speak up, since A, I'm British, and B, I've spoken in quite a few debates in the UK on the side of Remain. So I have argued against Brexiters and several times, and the argument I use and I think is and have been trying to encourage the Remain campaign to use is, I agree with this point that it's a question of narrative, and I think it's very hard to fight an identity-based political campaign with statistics. You need to create an alternative identity and narrative, and I don't think that, as the discussion here has been, confirms, I don't think that you can appeal to some European identity in a sort of as an alternative to a national identity. But I do think that the narrative has to be that Europe is still the only mechanism whereby the nations of Europe can look for common solutions to common problems in a very unstable world. And I think that, and of course the argument there rests on the idea that the EU can still provide solutions and that it is still a useful mechanism. I think that what the Brexit people would say is that the EU is the cause of a lot of that instability, and that a lot of the problems, the common problems, have been caused by overreach in the European project, with the Eurozone and the Schengen being the two most obvious examples. But I would still argue that that the EU is an evolving project. I think that the EU is that the Euro and the Schengen in themselves were common solutions to previous common problems. That the EU has been able over the last 5 or 6 years actually to evolve very rapidly in terms of providing common solutions, whether it's banking union, bailout funds, common border forces, new, the Turkey deal, Mediterranean patrols. I mean, the EU has been able to do a lot, and I think that's got to be to my mind, the narrative has to be this idea of a common European space that faces very common challenges, and that a mechanism is needed, and this is the best one that we have available, and that nobody has yet come up with an alternative. So that's how I would pitch that argument.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you for this, for basically sharing what you're trying to do, and I keep fingers crossed. But any other? Yeah, please.
Thank you. At the risk of perhaps kind of contradicting what I said before, but just for the sake of discussion, and because I'm French, I can contradict myself with no problem. The question is, do we absolutely need a new narrative? I mean, what's so wrong with the current one that we need to change? I mean, the main issue that I can kind of frame in an intelligible way for our citizens, for example, is the idea that the notion of solidarity is something that we kind of throw at each other when we have political disagreements. I mean, north to south solidarity, east-west solidarity on the refugee crisis. This is something that we kind of see coming. So, but what's so wrong with the narrative? I mean, the Schengen Agreement is still holding. The open borders are still holding. There are, safeguarding mechanisms that have allowed Germany to, close its borders for 6 months. Same thing for France. I mean, what's so wrong about it that we absolutely want to rethink all our secondary and tertiary text? I mean, quite frankly, I kind of ask myself whether this is something that we really want to go through, and whether we wouldn't be getting more than we're actually bargaining for, which perhaps explains why the way Europeans perceive the Brexit debate is, to a certain extent, nasty sometimes. But this is just my inward-looking question. And I'd be happy to hear Dalibor give me some thoughts.
So the current narrative being what, the ever closer union, or?
Yes, absolutely. And perhaps just come into the issues of legitimacy and credibility of the union, because when you have 1 million people in Germany protesting against TTIP, I mean, the core of the message is not TTIP itself. The core of the message is we are not consulted in these decisions. Our country is, our country does not have the ability to make sovereign decisions on the economy. So perhaps we should be thinking of questions of legitimacy and credibility that are also at the heart of the Troika mechanism in Greece, rather than thinking of creating a whole new narrative.
I don't see more questions and comments for now, and so we're reaching the final time of this workshop. I would ask you to have some final comments. I'm not sure we can make a summary. We had this poll. Who's running these polls? I don't know. You are? Okay, thank you very much. So the gentleman in the back asks us now, do we need to change current European narrative?
Nobody has voted yet.
And nobody wants to take position. That's fine. You can still do that. We had
I'm not sure we need to invent radically new narratives. Maybe it's just sort of me as a jaded cold-hearted economist speaking, but for me it's enough of a narrative to see that the EU is delivering on various fronts, that there are Europe-wide public goods that are being provided, economic openness, the fact that we've been, democratic, economically integrated and peaceful for 70 years, that we don't need a passport to travel across Schengen anymore, etc. I mean, these things are significant achievements that are making our lives much, much better than has been the historical benchmark. I think the trouble is that nobody is making even those arguments in a sort of forceful, convincing, energetic way. So I think there is a side to the EU's political legitimacy that's intrinsically linked to its practical side, to its ability to deliver. There is a book by Kathleen McNamara, but you have to buy my book anyway, but you can buy her book as well. It's called Politics of Everyday Europe. It came out last year with OUP, and she is a political scientist at Georgetown, and she essentially looks at the various very practical facets of European integration, how they have translated, in her mind, into a growing sense of European political nationhood, which is work in progress, hasn't been engineered by anybody, but it's sort of slowly emerging. And it's very well worth your research. So I think that's one practical side. But I think there is indeed an emotional component to all this, which I'm not sure we have to go around and try to sort of invent it or rewrite what we have. One of the most, what I thought was the most moving YouTube video posted by the Remain campaign was one with British World War II veterans reminiscing on their experience in the war and on what it meant for the European project, and they were all very, I think, convincing in saying that these were, our brothers in arms who were dying for the continent 70 plus years ago. And the European project was a response to what has been the most, the unimaginable bloodshed, the largest bloodshed in human history, and it would be a fatal blow to the entire thing if the UK now just abandoned it. Which is not to say that the EU is perfect, that it doesn't need to change. It's not perfect. It requires reform. I know. All the criticisms, I've been making them professionally for a living for a number of years. But I think it's really important that we have the British voice at the table, and that we sort of work together to repair this common European construction, because it still plays, I think, an irreplaceable role.
I just said we are having final comments now. So I thank you all for taking part, both asking questions, voting in the polls, and bringing comments and questions to the floor. I think we could sense that some uneasiness with the topic, and also debating these questions. One thing that strikes me is that we're still sort of long way after we began, or Europe has begun, a common Europe project, but still we're very early on the way to address the current issues of where Europe is. And we're just at the beginning of the road to address the questions of inward-lookingness, border anxiety, and the potential exits that are going to face us. But nevertheless, it's worth discussing. Thank you very much for introduction and then the remarks. Dalibor, thank you very much for participating.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.